Hey guys, today's lesson is going to be about blood and its composition. So knowing when you put the blood underneath the microscope, what are you looking at? And of those cells, because blood is made up of cells, it's the only fluid tissue in the body, which means tissue is made up of cells. Um, and cells, we're going to take a look at three different types of cells. And of course, your plasma as well. And then at the end, we'll get into hemostasis. In other words, what happens when you cut yourself and how it coagulates to stop the bleeding. A phlebotomist is a person that's trained in blood. You don't have to write anything down in your notes for this, but just as a possible career choice, if you want to do something that doesn't take up a lot of time to get your degree, the phlebotomist may be an example or a good career choice or a career choice while you're in school. Okay, so blood composition. What makes up blood? So again, it's the only fluid tissue in the body. So tissues are made up of cells. Blood is a type of connective tissue. It has two basic components. Cells, like I said, tissues are made up of cells. You have red blood cells, the abbreviation is RBC. White blood cells, WBC, and then you have platelets. Platelets are what are responsible for coagulation or stopping the bleeding. White blood cells are immunity, and red blood cells transports your red blood cells are going to transport the different gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide. Your plasma is mostly water, some proteins, amino acids. That's where your hormones are. So when when your hormones are moving within the blood system, it's actually moving throughout your plasma. So we're talking about the distribution. So basically what this is like, what are you looking at when percentage wise? It's called hematocrit. 45% of it are cells, 55% of it are plasma. So most of your blood is actually water. So if you took a vial and you put it in a centrifuge, essentially what it would spin it around in a circle really, really fast, causing denser molecules to sink to the bottom and lighter structures to go on top. For normal is what it should look like. So about 45% blood. The white blood cells are a very small percentage, and then plasma would rise to the top, which is 55%. So you can kind of see that here. Anemia. So if you're anemic, that means you have low amounts of red blood cells. I'll talk about later why that happens. So your red blood cells, so you would have a lot more plasma than 55%. So polycythemia, this would mean that you have a raised blood cells. Usually this is due to some sort of doping, which we'll talk about Lance Armstrong. This is essentially what he was doing. So hematopoiesis, this means the formation of blood cells. This occurs in the bone marrow. So hematopoiesis is the formation inside the bone. So we took the bone, cut it, like broke it in half, and looked inside. You may remember the chicken wing lab. We looked at the bone marrow. Hematopoiesis is that formation. Phagocytosis is when old cells are destroyed because red blood cells can't live forever, or can't work efficiently forever, so they go to the liver and spleen where they are recycled essentially and go back into the body. The cells are broken down to smaller portions for the body. Okay, so plasma, mostly water, 90% water, contains over 100 different solutes, nutrients, gases, hormones, waste products, ions, and proteins. I kind of want to take a look at the hormones and talk about that a little bit. So the mastery gland, the pituitary gland, when it secretes, let's say it's secreting TSH, so the thyroid stimulating hormone, it would go in the plasma to be carried to the thyroid, so the thyroid would then carry out its functions. So your plasma is a shuttle for molecules as well. So I talked about hormones. So how would it pick that up? So there's something called albumin. It shuttles certain molecules through circulation. It's an important blood buffer and maintains your water pressure. So albumin is kind of like the taxi cab for structures. It will hop on and hop off. Plasma, if you're interested, you can receive blood for your plasma. You sell your plasma essentially in your body. It's just mostly water, so your body just makes it over again. But you actually get money for selling that. You do have to be 18. Okay, so now we're in the blood cells, types of blood cells. So the first one is red blood cells, erythrocytes. Ureth means blood, or means red. Cytes means cells, so erythrocytes, urethral cells. Leukocytes, leuko means white, cytes, cell, so leukocytes, white blood cells. And thrombocytes is platelets. Thrombo means to clot, so platelets is what's going to help clot your blood. We're going to start with red blood cells. So when we're looking at a erythrocyte, this is what we're looking at here. They are smaller in structure compared to white blood cells. Biconcave discs, no nuclei. So there's no nucleus, means no DNA inside of a red blood cell. Hemoglobin, very important, is a protein that makes blood red. It binds easily with oxygen, and most of the oxygen is carried in blood is bound to hemoglobin. So you're going to learn that that's called oxyhemoglobin when the oxygen picks it up. So that's its job. Its job is to pick up the oxygen, the gases. It will pass through to simple diffusion, high to low pressure. We'll talk more about that next standard. Iron synthesizes hemoglobin, so if you are anemic, that means that you need to increase your iron. Without iron, you cannot make the hemoglobin, therefore you're not going to have as many red blood cells. Iron, one source would be animal muscle, so your steak, your chicken, things like that. You can also get it from plants. You can get a lot of irons in your spinach, your kale, dark leafy greens. So just as a myth of deoxygenated blood appears blue, this is deoxygenated blood. It is darker in color, but it is not blue. That's a myth. So this is what I was talking about earlier, where the red blood cell count was really high. It's a hormone called EPO, erythropoietin, and what it does is it increases the production of red blood cells. The more red blood cells you have, the more hemoglobin, and therefore you can have a lot more oxygen to your cells, causing a unfair advantage because your muscles especially are receiving more oxygen than what normally a hemostasis is supposed to apply. Okay, so now we're at white blood cells, leukocytes. The general function is to protect the body against disease. There are 5 different kinds of white blood cells. White blood cells are split up into 2 categories, granulocytes and agranulocytes. And I'll show you what it looks like. But when you're looking at the cell in the cytoplasm around the nucleus, you're going to see all these little spots. Those are the granulocytes. Agranulocytes means you're not going to see any of those spots in the cytoplasm, and that A means lacking of. Granulocytes, you have 3, neutrophil, eosinophil, basophils. Agranulocytes, you only have 2, monocytes and lymphocytes. For each of these, you need to know what the shape of the nuclei is, which I'll go over that, and its main function. So here is an example of all. So if we took your blood and put it underneath the microscope, this is what you would see. You would see white blood cells with all different types of shapes of nuclei, and that determines what kind it is. This would be a granulocyte. You can see the granules. Agranulocyte, there's lacking of. Red blood cells has that concave shape, biconcave shape, and that's your thrombocytes, which we'll talk about later. White blood cells are larger in comparison. So again, just looking at percentages, so agranulocytes, lymphocytes about 20-25%. Your monocyte has the least amount, one of the least amounts. Basophil, very small as well. And if you take a look, you mostly have neutrophils. It's like the highest of the types of cell. Your lymphocytes are very important. That's what your T cells, B cells, and your natural killer cells will turn into. More of the functions we'll go into during Unit 6, but for now you just have to know what they look like. Okay, so we'll start with neutrophil. Neutrophil, when you're looking, so it's a granulocyte, so you can see the granules in the cytoplasm. The nuclei will have more than 2 lobes. So this one has 1, 2, 3, has many lobes to them. Active phagocytes, 60% are white blood cells, and then we saw that earlier, and it's present in the pus of wounds. So anytime you have a cut or an opening, the neutrophil is going to be there, and if it gets to an infection with puses there, then you're going to have, that's where a lot of the neutrophil will be. The next one is the eosinophil. The nucleus is bilobed, so there's 2 lobes, 1, 2. It looks like headphones, like Beat headphones. I used to put on here like an old school telephone, but we don't really have those anymore, so a lot of kids don't even know what that is. An old school, or more like Beats is what the new age, I guess, way to say it. It's granulocytes, there's granules, and its job is to attack parasites. Basophil. The nucleus again is also bilobed. It's produced, and you can see again it's granulocytes. It's a blood thinner called heparin, and it contains histamines, so it's important for the inflammatory reaction. So, which we'll talk more about that later on, but histamine is produced by the basophil. So now we're in the agranulocytes. These will not have granules. These kind of look like they do, but they don't. They would be clear. Monocyte is a large cell, so of all the cells, it's very big in comparison. That's how you can tell. Horseshoe-shaped nucleus, but honestly, the large cell is how you identify it. Just think mono is one large cell. Develop into a macrophage, which is good for immunity. Lymphocytes, the last one, it's another agranulocyte. This one you can tell pretty easily because it's only one nuclei, and it's large and it's round and takes up most of the cell. It produces your antibodies. So this is an example. These would be all your red blood cells. You can tell because there's no nuclei. That's darker. So your nuclei always dyes darker. I think I told you guys that in Unit 1. So these are 2 of your white blood cells. This would be your lymphocyte. You can tell because the nuclei is large, one large round nuclei. This would be your neutrophil. It's multi-lobed. Just as a review that these are made in your bone marrow. So like in the femur, for instance, in the very middle, that's your marrow, and that's where your cells would be produced. Okay, so now platelets. Platelets are called thrombocytes because thrombo means to clot. It's for blood clots and vessel repair, closes, breaks, and damaged blood vessels. Okay, so now we're going to get to hemostasis. When a blood vessel wall breaks, a series of reactions will be set in motion. Without this quote-unquote plug the hole defensive reaction, you would bleed out. So this is what the steps will involve. Step 1 is called vascular spasm. Your smooth muscle inside of your cell will start to contract, so causing vasoconstriction. These reflexes are actually started because of the pain receptor. So when you feel pain, that is the way that your body is trying to stop the bleeding with the smooth muscle contraction. A strongly constricted artery can reduce blood loss for up to 20 to 30 minutes, allowing for these following steps. So step 1, smooth muscle constricts. The next step is platelet plug formation. So this is called aggregation. So the platelets release a chemical and it makes them all kind of sticky, and the platelets literally stick to each other. So they'll stick to one another and temporarily seal. So it's like your body's Band-Aid. So these events will all lead up to that blood clot. So that's what it looks like. So these platelets, imagine all the platelets becoming sticky and they like bind together, essentially, aggregation, and they stop the bleeding for a moment. The last part will be coagulation. The third step reinforces that platelet plug. There's something called a fibrin. Fibrin forms this mesh. It's like a net, and the net will trap a whole bunch of red blood cells, white blood cells, anything it can catch, and it will form the clot down. Thrombin is the enzyme that will actually catalyze the clotting. So off to the side, you have this enzyme that's working at the same time to help this all occur. So this is the platelets coming together, and this is what the fibrin would look like, the net. So these are all the steps of the hemostasis. You've got vasoconstriction, that's the constriction of the vessel. You've got platelets, all the platelets sticking to each other, stopping the bleeding here, and then you have the fibrin net catching red blood cells, all the cells to reinforce that. 2 disorders, you have thrombus. So that would be like having like a big clot in the area. An embolus would be if that clot broke and went into another place. Okay, and that's it for now. Thank you very much. We'll go over all this stuff next week.